It was at that point that a thought occurred to Rose. Her mother said that the thorns would emerge on their own, were she in a position where she felt that her life was in jeopardy, as a defensive measure. So maybe Rose didn't need the desire to kill, only the desire to protect herself. She might be able to make that work, she thought to herself as she glared intensely at her hands still. Okay, but how do I get the desire to protect myself? Rose thought to herself. So how about I try visualizing something that scares me? Something that I'm scared of trying to hurt me. That might work, she thought to herself as she closed her eyes and began trying to picture it. Something trying to hurt her. But once again, this was not a feeling that Rose was accustomed to. Nothing had ever actually tried to attack her. So obviously, she was having a very hard time with it and couldn't seem to picture anything. Even when she pictured animals, even dangerous ones like bears or tigers, she didn't really feel fear because she had never been hunted by a bear or a tiger or attacked by one. She didn't know what it was like to be afraid of them. She had only ever seen them on Animal World, a nature-based cable television show. Even when she tried to imagine them pouncing on her or coming after her, the idea itself just seemed silly. It didn't seem to arouse any fear or a desire to protect herself. So Rose sat there for some time, working through multiple visualizations, trying to find the feeling of being in danger, and wasn't having much luck. Finally, she took a deep sigh. This is much harder than I thought it was going to be, she said. I can't seem to visualize anything that will trigger it. Are you sure you don't have any other tips for me? She asked her mother. I'm sorry, Rose, but I'm not an Okar. Our abilities don't work in the same way. I'm not accustomed to having to trigger emotions, and so I'm afraid I can't be much help. This is one that you'll have to figure out on your own, but that you do have to figure out. Rose sighed once more. Okay, Mom, she replied, returning to closing her eyes and trying to focus. But nothing seemed to be coming to mind. Nothing that she was actually afraid of. She wasn't really scared by animals. She rather liked them. And then an image crossed Rose's mind. It wasn't of an animal. It wasn't of something real. No, it was of something from the world of fantasy, specifically horror. Rose remembered a horror movie that, quite frankly, terrified her. It was a movie about werewolves. Specifically, the entire movie was set around a group of individuals, all trying to figure out which one of them was a werewolf, as the werewolf slowly killed them off one by one. It was all done with special effects, but the image of that werewolf attacking was still terrifying. It sent shivers down her spine whenever she thought about it. She had went to see the movie with her friends, but had bad dreams about it for days afterwards. She just kept seeing its fangs and claws. There was one specific scene that bothered her the most. A scene of a woman in a hallway, trapped at the end with all of the doors being steel and locked tight. And she had nowhere to go as the werewolf crept up on her. She just had to watch it slowly coming down the hallway in the middle of the night, passing through shadows and bits of light that would shine through windows. It wasn't even walking on the ground. No, it was crawling across the ceilings and the walls. With her trapped at the end of the hallway, it wasn't even in a rush. It just slowly crawled its way down the hallway towards her, one step at a time, getting closer, its long nails digging into the stone walls, its fur dark, gray and matted, covered in blood, and glowing red eyes staring out at her. Rose had had multiple nightmares about that image. Just then, Rose began to feel a tingling in her fingertips. Her eyes shot open for a minute as she looked down at her hands, still feeling that tingling sensation. And as she looked, there weren't any long nails emerging, but she could see the color and tone of her fingernails changing. They shifted to a light green color. And just then, Rose smiled a bit. "Yes!" she shouted. "It's working!" "It is?" Rose's mother said, beginning to look at her curiously. "Did you find something? What was it?" Rose looked towards her mother with a slight smile. "Well, it turns out that I don't have to use the desire to kill. I had an idea that maybe I could just trigger defensive instincts by thinking of something that made me afraid. And it's working. My nails changed color. See?" she said, holding up the back of her hands towards her mother. "Yes, I can see it," she said, looking at them for a moment before letting out a small chuckle. "You know, that's just like you," she said. "Leave it to my daughter to completely avoid the desire to kill and find a different way, her own way." "So, what was it that you pictured?" her mother asked. It was a scary movie that I saw with my friends. You know, I had nightmares about it for a while afterwards. You remember, I told you about it, right?" "Oh, yes, I remember it." "Quite strange," Rose's mother said. "And I was expecting you to actually imagine something real, and instead you picture something imaginary. And real or not, it seems to work. But you won't find me complaining. I would much rather you rely on the feeling of needing to defend yourself than the desire to kill. And I would much rather have you afraid of something that you're in no danger of than of something that's actually going to hurt you." "Okay, I've got this," Rose said, going back to closing her eyes and trying to focus on that image, continuing to try to make it more intense, try to visualize it more clearly, even beginning to insert herself in place of the person who was actually there in the movie. Imagine that it was her that the wolf was creeping up on, picturing it as clearly as she could, all of which sent shivers down her spine. The feeling of trying to focus on something that she was afraid of was not an easy task. The more she tried to picture it, the more afraid of it she got, and the more her mind seemed to want to stray off or block it out. She was having to fight her own compulsion to not be afraid. "Focus," she said. "Claws, fangs, a dark hallway. I'm there. It's coming for me. It's coming for me," she said. Again, Rose began to feel the tingling in the tips of her fingers. That grew very intense until there was a sudden warmth that radiated out from her fingers. She felt her fingers convulse, jolting outward, straightening themselves, as if she was suddenly shocked with something. And as Rose opened her eyes, looking at her hands, there, sliding out from her fingernails, were exceptionally long, very sharp-looking green barbs, as if they were extended from her nails herself, like they simply grew long, changing their color and tone. "Whoa, that is so freaky," she said, staring down at the long, sharp-looking nails, beginning to finally move her fingers around a bit, finding that she could move her hands and fingers. As she rubbed one of the nails against another one, they made a very interesting sound. It almost sounded like metal, like scraping two forks together, which told Rose that these nails, these thorns, were exceptionally strong, like metal.